God's sovereign plan. Though our journey through life includes many human factors, we must remember that God's sovereign plan for each one of us continues to unfold. Here now is Gene Getz.
This principle really comes from the whole biblical story. God is sovereign. God is sovereign in history. It's a difficult concept for us to comprehend, but it's true. We see it from Genesis to Revelation. But here in 2 Samuel, the principle is illustrated in the life of David. And we see this principle of God's sovereignty illustrated in the lives of many of God's children throughout the biblical story. But here, the focus, of course, is on David. And so what happened is that after Saul's death, David was anointed king over Judah, not over all Israel, but over Judah. And we read about that in 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1. The war between the house of Saul and the house of David was long and drawn out, with David growing stronger and the house of Saul becoming weaker. And this went on for 7 years. This was an incredible process that they went through with a lot of human elements. But in 2 Samuel chapter 5, we see the culmination here in verses 4 and 5, that David was 30 years old when he began his reign. He reigned 40 years. But in Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem, he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah, rounding out that number to 40 years. That was the totality of David's reign, beginning in Judah and then all Israel. Now, as you look through this whole process, and particularly this first 7 years, there are a lot of human elements, a lot of very human elements in the life of David and others. For example, you see his humanness, you see his weaknesses. And that's part of God's grace that we see in the life of David, because we so many times we I think lift David up and we set him up on a pedestal where he was a very flawed individual. He had a heart for God, but yet he was a very flawed individual. For example, we read about Michal, his wife, and early on when David was becoming popular in Israel, before Saul even got angry at him. But then Saul's anger and jealousy took over, and he had a daughter named Michal, and Michal really loved David. And so what happened? He gave Michal to David to be his wife. But if you look at the context, he gave her to him to be his wife in order to be able to take out David. I mean, even there in the marriage situation, he was using his own daughter to try to get to David. And you see that flawed element in Saul, but you begin to see the flawed element in David, because what happened is that once Saul was dead, and once he was ruler over Judah, and then the tribes of Israel, the leaders in the tribes of Israel came and tried to make peace during the 7-year time. And what did David do? He said, I will if you'll bring Michal back to me. Because, see, Saul had taken her away and given her to another man. And it's a sad story, because here is David, who's already married, he has other women, and he said, okay, I'll do this if you'll bring Michal back. And so they go and take Michal away from her husband, and he cries after her. Why did David do that? Ego. His humanness. And yet, in spite of his humanness, see, God was sovereign in his life in terms of his divine plan. He was a very human individual, and he was very flawed. And you see that in David. One of his great characteristics was when he realized he was sinful, he was repentant. And we'll see that even in his greatest failure as the story unfolds in terms of what happened in terms of his adulterous relationship with Bathsheba. Another human aspect during the 7-year period of time, or really later on, he wanted to bring the ark to Jerusalem. And so he didn't consult God. He goes out and takes this very, very holy ark that God had created with the commandments inside, didn't follow the instructions, and one of his men lost his life. And what did David do? He got angry. He got angry at God. But he hadn't consulted God. Now, the redeeming feature is that once he saw his failure, he repented. But what I'm telling you is, as you look at even the 7 years, you see David's weaknesses. And I point that out because in spite of his weaknesses, God was still in control. God still had a plan. And he was unfolding this plan through David. And consequently, as a result of this, God extended the Abrahamic covenant to what we call the Davidic covenant. The Lord's covenant with David. And this basically is the covenant with David. Your house and kingdom will endure before me forever, and your throne will be established forever. Now, in terms of this Davidic covenant, if you look at that covenant, you realize this. While some elements of this covenant include David's son Solomon, there are elements that project ahead to the greater son of David, Jesus Christ. And that's one of the marvelous things about these promises and prophecies that we read in the Old Testament. There was a meaning that was primary at the moment, but there was also a greater meaning that was pointing forward to the coming of Jesus Christ. And when you read through this whole chapter dealing with this covenant that God made with David, you see this ultimate promise of the coming of Jesus Christ. And Peter recognized this in his sermon on the day of Pentecost. And Peter himself and the other apostles had a difficult time understanding some of these Old Testament passages, but God enabled through the Spirit of God for Peter to understand the Davidic covenant, because we read, "Brothers, I can confidently speak to you about the patriarch David." Now, remember, this is the day of Pentecost, and Peter's explaining what has happened in relationship to the coming of Jesus Christ. And so he said about the patriarch David, he said, "He is both dead and buried, and his tomb is with us to this day." In other words, Jesus Christ rose from the dead, and he walked among us. David never did that. So the promise that was given back to David is pointing to the greater David, which is Jesus Christ. And you see that element in that Davidic covenant, even though a lot of it referred to Solomon. And so we read on in Peter's sermon, "Since he was a prophet," that is, David was a prophet, "he knew that God had sworn an oath to him to seat one of his descendants on his throne. Seeing this in advance, he spoke concerning the resurrection of the Messiah." And right there in that covenant that God made with David, there is a projection ahead, and even David said it himself, but he didn't understand it all, but he was referring to the resurrection of the Messiah. And so Peter's saying, David died. He wasn't raised from the dead like Jesus Christ. But Jesus Christ was raised from the dead. He was not left in Hades. His flesh did not experience decay. In the Life Essential Study Bible, when I was explaining this, and let me just read from the Life Essential Study Bible a paragraph that I included here. And basically, this is what it says. This happens to be on page 399, and this is the principle that we're developing. Though God's sovereign plan to redeem sinful humanity involved people who are all seriously flawed as human beings, and David was one of them. But you have men like Abraham. Abraham was flawed. He was human. Isaac, he really messed up in his life. Jacob, wow, he was the deceiver. And yet, he was the one that God chose to give birth to those 12 sons. And then there's David. The principle, however, still applies to all believers who have put their faith in Jesus Christ. In spite of our mistakes, in spite of our failures, in spite of our weaknesses, God is still in control. Though we're responsible for any decisions that are out of the will of God, just like David was. He was responsible for his mistakes. Yet, God's sovereign plan blends with our humanness, including our foolish and selfish actions. And we've seen that in the life of David. He made some very selfish, foolish decisions that created all kinds of problems. And yet, God's plan was unfolding through him. Thankfully, though, even though we cannot comprehend this great antinomy, we can claim the eternal truth in Romans. And this is that statement in Romans that is so significant. Romans 8:28. We know that all things, this is Paul writing to the Romans, we know that all things work together for the good of those who love God, those who are called according to his purpose. Joseph experienced this. If you go back to Joseph, there's a principle, I call it Principle 70 in Genesis, and it reads this way. The caption of that principle is understanding God's purpose. Now, this has to do with Joseph. When we face difficult situations, we should ask God to help us see some divine meaning in these experiences. And Joseph illustrates this more than any Old Testament character, because you remember his brothers sold him into Egypt. He was falsely accused by Potiphar, or by Potiphar's wife, of sexual harassment. He went to prison. He languished in prison. Ultimately, he became next to the Pharaoh in Egypt, and God honored him there. And eventually his brothers came down with their father, Jacob, and he saved their life because of the fact that he became the premier in Egypt and prepared for the famine, the 7 years of famine, then after the 7 years of plenty. And then his father Jacob died after they all came down to Egypt. Then the brothers thought he was going to get even. And when Joseph found out about it, he said, man, you meant it to me for evil, but God meant it to me for good. Now, how do you figure that out? You meant it to me for evil, but God meant it to me for good. In essence, the principle you see here that grows out of that, I just read it, understanding God's purpose. God has a sovereign plan. And Joseph understood that in his own way. And it relates back to Romans 8:28. All things working together for good to those that love the Lord. Now, the reflection and response question basically is, in what circumstances is it often difficult to accept and believe that God is sovereign and that Romans 8:28 is true? Wow, there are just lots of situations. Lots of situations. For example, natural disasters. How do you figure this out? Innocent people, little children, destroyed, wiped out through disasters, tsunamis, or sexual abuse of little children. Or, how do you explain that all things work together for good under those circumstances? War and all the stuff that goes along with that. I can't even explain how God used Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and his sons, as flawed as they were. And yet he did. We see that, of course, not just with the sons of Jacob, we see that with David. Job, even Job, when he couldn't even see meaning in his suffering, he gives us an incredible illustration when he says, though he slay me, though God slays me, yet I'll trust him. Now, ultimately, Job understood that unique situation. But the fact is, there are many times in life we will not understand God's purpose until eternity. We just cannot understand it. But we're to trust God. And that takes faith. To trust God even if we never see meaning in this life.